Here we are again. Thank you for being with me, and we're grateful for the opportunity to continue this relationship. Hope you're finding it profitable and beneficial. It has really been helpful to me, and hopefully to you and maybe others that you want to share these ideas with. Keep in mind that what we're trying to do is to look at the land, and the land that we live in. The church in America lives in this land in the United States of America, and we want to kind of compare that with what the Old Testament church went through. So we have the Old Testament church, Israel, in a certain geography, and they were a people that were set apart and distinctive. But there were those people groups and nations that were around them that radically affected or impacted Israel as the Old Testament church, and that Israel would need to be very careful about her own condition that would affect the land. If Israel would experience a cleansing and a submission and a supplication, remember those in 2 Chronicles 7:14. If Israel maintained her relationship with her Lord God, the Creator God, the forgiving God that had made all that possible, and revealed Himself to them, and if they continued to turn from their wicked ways, then the land around them, that is the dirt, the things that they were depending on for sustenance of life, would be healed. And also there would be hopefully and also we have evidence in the Old Testament of the deliverance from the enemies of Israel that would have annihilated them or would have influenced, infiltrated into this Old Testament church culture. Well, I think the same thing can be applied to the church today or in any age, because the Old Testament has been given to us as an example for us to learn, Romans 15. So in the United States, we've been looking specifically at the United States, and we've been looking at the church in the United States. And I've already made reference to the wickedness, what I thought of the American church. You can go back and look that up in previous teachings. But now what about heal their land? What does this land need to be healed of? We're very bountifully blessed from this land materially. The church is, and everyone that lives here. And it's what else is there to be healed from? And proposed there are other things that in this land that need to be healed. The land needs to be healed of a lot of different things. The people who live in this land need to be healed of a lot of different things. And the church has to be very careful that we in this land are not impacted and impenetrated with these things that are the dynamics that are going on. That's kind of where we are right now. And I'll just give you a list of these just by review. I've already suggested that the land is changing. This nation is changing, and I've gone back about 120 years. Early part of the 20th century, we have moved away from the rural area, from the farming area communities, and living more in cities. It's a major shift, and it's had a major impact on a lot of other dynamics that have been forthcoming in the American culture. Number two is this issue of the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of family life. And I made reference to this and statistical information that gives you some idea about what the changes occurred in this same period of time, 120 years, something like that. And the quotation from this book that I value and the statistical data that this person comes to the conclusion that the disappearance of family life, the waning of family life as we know it between a man and a woman and children, has been the most radical social change during this period of time. That's number two. And then number three is the idea, which kind of follows this, the idea of bearing children and the sanctity of human life. And so we see then that some of the things that's happened in the last 100 years or so, medically speaking, the pill came along, remember that, and that changed a lot of the ideas about fertility and having children and when they can be had, when they can be born. And then we have information that tells us from the CDC and other sources and the census data that there's been the lowest number of fertility. We're not having children like we used to in the United States, in the land. And also we're seeing then, consequently, that we're seeing the population kind of moderate. And I think I've got the statistics here that just recently in 2019, the Census Bureau released this, that we've had the slightest increase in population in 120 years. So we're not having a lot of children in the United States, families, and I'm talking about as a whole, but hopefully not in the church. But we're having fewer children. Population is not increasing very much, very, very slightly over this period of time. And at the same time, and during this period of 100 years, so we're having less children are being born because of abortion and the the confirmation of that 1973 with the right that women have over their bodies to do what they want to with their bodies. And so over 60 million children during this time have been killed, murdered, and genocide of over 60 million children in the United States. That the other genocides in the other parts of the world in the 20th century doesn't even compare to what we've done here, and to our children, to the innocent, the ones who hopefully should be the most protected. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but that is horrific. It's just horrible. And there's a serious judgment upon this nation because of that atrocity alone, I think, as well as everything that goes along with it, and the demise of marriage and the demise of having children, that they're an expediency, they're a lot of trouble. And so maybe couples just choose not to have children. And that's maybe a trend in some ways in the United States. Maybe it's because of hard times. I don't know why men and women as husbands and wives would not want to have children, even in the most difficult times. There's provisions that can be had for them. Now, number 4, see the trend. We have a trend away from the earth, so to speak, into the cities. We have then also we have this new view of marriage is waning. The old view of marriage is waning. I say the old view, the traditional view, and the biblical view is changing. And then we have childbearing being affected by that, and of course, life itself is the sanctity of life is changing. Of course, the view of human life and the worth of humans has been changing in this culture. And then number 4, I brought this up just briefly last time: sexual permissiveness, and sexual identity confusion. Now, can you expect all this to kind of link together? This permissiveness, since the drift away in our culture, has been away from sexual relations between a man and a woman in a committed, lifelong relationship as husband and wife. Since there's been this drift away from that in the last 120 years, then there's been a proliferation of sexual permissiveness and experimentation. Now, sexual permissiveness, that's been with us since the very beginning of humanity. That's nothing new. And also this experimentation of human sexuality is not new also. But in this culture, in this nation, in this land, we're seeing this proliferation as possible never before, because we're keeping a lot more statistics, and statistical research indicates that behaviors regarding human sexuality have changed in the last 100 years in the United States. Since the 1930s, in our nation, ideas about premarital sexual behavior now include the acceptance of promiscuity. There was a time when, that was something frowned upon, and but now it's more and more acceptable. And so with that, you've got men and women who are living together, cohabitation. They are shacking up, and there's allowances for that in our culture, common law marriages and things like this. But there's doesn't seem to be this commitment between this fidelity between this man and woman as a husband and wife like we once had in this land. And this is amazing. I say amazing. It's just how deviant the human mind can be in regard to what has been decided and prescribed by the Creator. So we have the acceptance of this experimentation in sexual relations, and that is including homosexuality. And I'm not going to get into a lot about that. I just think we know there's just and every one of these, I've made this statement before, every one of these have horrible, detrimental results to the individual and also to the relationship. And there's immediate and long-term effect on all this new ideas about how to relate to one another, men and women, men to men, women to women, and other things in regard to sexual identity. There's all kinds of horrific, difficult things that occur. I'm going to give you some examples of that just in homosexuality. I think it's common knowledge that in the United States, homosexual men are disproportionately at the risk of getting HIV and AIDS. In 2016, 68% of all of these infections in the United States affected men who have sex with other men. And this is even higher with black men. And this is from Elizabeth Bosky, and she's a PhD, does a lot of research. She does a lot of research on infectious diseases. So I think it's pretty well common knowledge that a lot of these diseases are going to accompany homosexuality, not to even include the psychological and the social dynamics that are detrimental in those relationships. And hey, we'll talk some more about that if you want to. You let me know, and you want to send me some information or whatever on that. There's a great debate about homosexuality since the 1980s and 90s, and it's come into the church. And the idea that the biblical prohibitions on homosexuality are they're for the what you might call those times, and those times had to do with cultic practices and all the immoralities of people who were mistreating each other. Well, now that we've got loving relationships between men and women, that's a lot different. And so the prohibitions in the Bible don't really apply today because that now these are loving relationships. So that's an argument for them. And then you got the argument about genetics and all that kind of thing. So anyway, I've got a lot of information on that if you're interested. Bisexuality, transgenderism. I think you know about this. This is another experimentation, and it's kind of popular. All these are very in the minority. This is not the norm. But what's happening is that you have the acceptance of these things. At one time, homosexuality was not accepted in the culture, but now it's more and more. And I think this idea of being accepted, even though you may not agree with it, is more of an empathetic kind of reaction in the culture to these deviations. And let me comment about this transgenderism that I've got here. And this author is Abigail Shriver, and she's just released a book entitled Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Now, she talks about girls, but also boys have been impacted by this same kind of dynamic, but it seems to be more faddish with young girls that to redefine themselves in their biological traits to become more of something that they want to be, other than who they are and who they were born to be. And here's a quote from her book. We have an absolute epidemic of teenage girls who do not seem to have typical gender dysphoria. And that word dysphoria is used a lot in psychological literature and stuff. It's a very unhappy and dissatisfied and a hard to bear situation, whatever dysphoria of whatever situation might be. This is gender dysphoria. So these young girls who are involved in this are nonetheless, again, they're convincing themselves that they have this gender discomfort, this unhappiness and dissatisfaction. Medical science is kind of doing that. Parents, I guess, they collaborate with this. They rush to hormones, she says, and they rush to surgeries. This group of girls are the largest and fastest growing demographic. And this is throughout the West, and I guess she says West is going to be Europe and the United States, and then other nations where the Western culture is imported. These young women have a lot of other mental problems. There are a lot of other mental problems to go along with this confusion, of this gender confusion. And she cites depression, and she's done research, she's done interviews, depression, anxiety, and they're involved in cutting, she says, cutting themselves. There's a lot of self-harm with this population. And she says this population that already has mental problems is self-diagnosing with gender dysphoria. I mean, see the confusion that's going on? And it just hasn't happened overnight. This is something that's been going on 100 so years with the moving away from biblical principles, biblical identity as maleness and femaleness, and biblical roles as husbands and wives. And since this culture has drifted away from what would be the norms 120 years ago or so, in the 19th century, even before that, but now into the 20th century and now 21st century, since we've drifted away like this, here's this kind of experimentation that we have, in which there's this real serious idea that they need to evaluate themselves as to their own gender, as to what their biological identity. Now, there's another one. So we've got homosexuality, we've got bisexuality, we've got transgenderism. Maybe you've heard of this, polyamory. Polyamory, where men, women have multiple relationships, consenting multiple relationships with men to men, women to women, men, women. It doesn't really matter. Sexual relationships at the same time. Polyamory. Love or something. In loving relationships, they say. But it's just with multiple people. Janie Chaney tackles this, or she raises this, and this is a article she came in contact with, and it came from the universities, come from colleges, and this is a psychology professor at a well-known university, and he writes an article. We just got to accept this. Here's the title: Polyamory is growing, and we need to get serious about it. And so, thankfully, there's a kickback on this article, and it has to do with, because what do you do with children if you have these multiple relationships with these different people, consenting adults, and then there's no focus on children, no focus on childbearing. So the impact is on the third dimension of this relationship between a man and a woman. Now, when you have two men in this homosexual relationship, or two women, lesbianism, when you have these, there's no focus on children. And you say, wait a minute now, I know there's adoption. I know that these two men or these two women adopt children, and there are states that are allowing this to occur and everything. There's statistical research to say that is not a healthy relationship for children. That is not the best relationship for children to grow up in, and I can cite you research about that. And so the emphasis in these experimentation is not on children. It's on themselves. It's on the people themselves. What am I going to get out of this? How do I benefit from this? All the way from transgenderism to any of these experimentations. This is an interesting view that Janie Chaney brings up in her article in World Magazine. And she says that it's the triad. It's the triad. She says that there's the universe. The universe is built on triads, and you have two parts, but you have a third part that keeps the two parts functioning, and it's a triactic relationships. And the Bible is going to say that also in humanly, the relationship between a man and a woman, and then procreation. That's one of the main reasons for having the relationship between husbands and wives is to have children, and that's a triad. That's three. And of course, you have one, and their children. There's more than some couples have two. Some couples have 8 or 9. Doesn't really matter the number. It's just the third dimension of family life. Children benefit by that kind of relationship. Now, there's a lot of trouble in these. We have trouble in families like this. There's no doubt about there's a lot of difficulties. We need to help support. The church needs to help support family life. We talked about that before. Here's what she says. As Augustine, this is like the 4th century, St. Augustine, one of the important men of church history. Triactic structures form the foundation of the universe, he writes, built upon the creative dynamic of Father, Son, and Spirit. Isn't that interesting? You have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. They have a triad here, and that's an illustration of how the universe is going to be formed, is going to be shaped. But what you have is, with this sexual experimentation, you have individualism, and you have the individual deciding what they think is best for them. And it's really at the expense of other people too. It's at the expense of the person that's going to be involved in that relationship. They call it loving relationships. People in this experimentation, they call it very, very affectionate, very compassionate, but it's all about the person. It's all about what the person wants to gain in the relationship. So I thought you'd be interested in that view of polyamory dynamic that's going on right now. Stay with me on this. I want to thank a good friend of mine for sending me a response to last time's the teaching I did last time. He brought up a very important dynamic in our culture, and that is education. And I thank him for reminding me about that. And so I'm going to be making some comments about education in the United States and maybe what trends and what drift is going on, but like a broad sweep. And it's not going to be applicable to everybody, but it's going to be something we need to deal with. Education in the United States. I want to thank him for doing that. I've had 2 conversations this week about the state of the American church in the land in which we live. And I hope you are also evaluating your own relationship to Christ, first of all, in a personal relationship. And then where do you fit? Where does your family fit into the American church today with all the dynamics that's going on and all the changes that's going on? I personally believe, and I responded this way, I personally believe that it's a great opportunity for the church to reevaluate the form. Could we have a revolution of form? We've had a revolution of doctrine in the 16th century with the Reformation. Could we now have a revelation of form? The church, I believe, confidently, I'm convinced, needs to seriously look at the form of church life. And I will have something to say about that sometime in the future, and I hope you'll stay with me on that. So thank you for being with me. I enjoyed this time together, and I look forward to being with you again soon. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. May He guide you, and may you seek to know Him more than any other knowledge that you can have in your life.